Okay, welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to our conference on autonomy and its discontents. It's a great pleasure to see you all here. I'm very excited about the conference and about the next two days. Autonomy is, as we all know, an idea that deeply informs our current self-understanding. It is one of the central aspirations of our time, I think it's safe to say, to become and to be autonomous. Everything that defines us and makes us who we are, it seems to depend on it. Only to the extent that we become autonomous beings can we act freely and of our own accord, become accountable and responsible, and capable of succeeding and failing in meaningful ways. There's certainly a great variety of either substantive or procedural, more metaphysically demanding and practically demanding or more moderate conceptions of this ideal of autonomy. But despite all the differences in the conceptions, I think the various conceptions share the basic assumption that it is constituted for the kind of beings that we are to strive for autonomy. Against this background, it seems almost impossible to be against autonomy or to not want to be autonomous. At the same time, however, and there is a deep and growing discontent with autonomy, not just in the theoretical literature, but in our everyday experience of its ramifications. Not only has the very notion of autonomy been suspected of being self-contradictory since its very beginning, or since its paradigmatic formulation by Kant, firstly, because the idea of self-legislation seems to contain a paradox that makes autonomy revert to arbitrariness or heteronomy, and secondly, because autonomy requires an unconditional spontaneity that seems to be in tension with our existence as natural beings and turns the reality of freedom into a mystery. Moreover, and more urgently, however, the idea of autonomy is under pressure in the present because the concrete form it has taken in contemporary societies gives rise to the feeling that autonomy has not liberated us, but instead rather subjected us to new forms of unfreedom. This manifests itself in the dissatisfaction we can detect in those who are, by all standards, perfectly autonomous, but can't shake the feeling they are constrained and ruled, unresponsive to themselves and to others, detached from themselves, the world, and their fellow humans in their autonomy. It just as well manifests in the experience of misrecognition and exclusion made by those who don't conform to the ideal of the free, self-sufficient, autonomous subject existing in splendid isolation and independence, a law unto itself. If that is right, autonomy is experienced as a form of domination and subjugation and of dissatisfaction, we could say, both by the ones exemplifying it and by those who are excluded due to their presumed lack of it. The discontent goes so far that it is not unusual to hear these days the assessment that autonomy involves a misguided Western, male, ableist notion of freedom, an agency that fails to account for important dimensions of human life and is of an inherently exclusionary nature. If we step back a bit and ask in what way autonomy might in fact imply domination rather than liberation, I think we should consider three key relations: our relation to ourselves, to nature, and to others. In all three respects, there is the worry that autonomy, understood as the rule of the free over the unfree, involves domination, self-domination, domination of nature, and social domination. As far as my relationship to myself is concerned, the suspicion is that autonomy ultimately requires self-domination, one part of myself ruling over and actually dominating another part of me. If that were true, autonomy would involve a hidden internalized form of heteronomy. Autonomy would actually be rule of one over another, even if it's just instantiated internally. Put more concretely, the worry is often articulated as the worry that autonomy involves an overly intellectualist or rationalist conception of freedom, identifying our freedom with our rational self and denying our sensible nature a right of its own. This worry is familiar to us at least since Schiller's letters on the aesthetic education of man, questioning the self-domination model of autonomy Schiller had identified in Kant. Now, with regard to our relationship with nature, with the nature that surrounds us, the suspicion is that autonomy is linked to an instrumental and exploitative relationship with nature, which underlies the current ecological crisis and which existentially threatens our ability to determine our own future. So if you think that through, there's a way in which autonomy here undermines itself. Yeah. Understood as the rule of the free over the unfree, the ideal of autonomy would thus not connect us to the world, but rather alienate us from the world, turning it into a mere aggregate of instruments and resources. If that is right, autonomy would involve a structural disregard for its own genetic, material, and formal conditions of possibility, a disregard for life. This worry is familiar to us at least since Hegel's critique of Fichte's conception of the state, which implies, and I quote Hegel, a rule of reason and servitude of the living. Finally, with regard to our relationship with others, the concern is that autonomy has not freed us from social power, but rather subjected us to ever more comprehensive mechanisms of social control that insidiously no longer even present themselves as forms of domination. This is true in at least two respects or ways, I think. Firstly, autonomy appears as an introjection of social power, allowing social regimes of power to rule us without us even fully realizing it, because we do it to ourselves, and without the need for any explicit masters. Secondly, autonomy, if conceived as a challenging achievement, allows for the social differentiation between those who live up to the ideal of autonomy and those who do not, and are thus rightfully guided, governed, ruled by others, the autonomous ones. Autonomy therefore allows for a return of mastery and exclusion, but one that now seems to be capable of being defended as being based on merit and based on the very ideal of freedom. So there's an unfreedom justified by the very ideal of freedom. The worry that autonomy, agency, and capacity are internally linked to a subjection to social power and to new models of social stratification and exclusion is familiar to us, at least, I would think, since Althusser's and Foucault's critique of the disciplinary subject. Now, at this conference, we want to first explore this diagnosis of a crisis of autonomy and the various ways in which it manifests itself in conceptual paradoxes, forms of subjective suffering, social pathologies, and social conflicts. Secondly, we want to explore what follows from these diagnoses. Does the crisis of autonomy reveal the misguidedness of the very idea of autonomy and require an outright rejection of the idea? Do we maybe need a wholly different conception of, and I quote, freedom without autonomy or heteronomy without servitude, as Derrida once put it? Or do we need to hold on to the modern notion that freedom requires self-determination? And if so, how can we rethink self-determination in new ways, such that it does not simply amount to a mode of domination of ourselves, of nature, and of others? In the next 2 days, we will explore a variety of answers, I think, to these questions that draw on a number of critical and constructive resources for doing so. A number of contributions will in particular explore the resources we find in aesthetics, in new types of naturalism, in the feminist critique and rearticulation of autonomy, and in the attempt to develop social and relational conceptions of autonomy. I'm very much looking forward to the talks during the next 2 days and to learning more about the resources we may find in these discourses for rethinking self-determination in such a way that it does not amount to a domination of ourselves, of nature, and of others, but liberates our self-relation, our relation to nature and to others.